Section 58 of The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 58. He was not repeating this thing, that thinking is existing. He was not repeating that he was understanding, completely understanding, that thinking is existing. He was naturally, completely understanding that thinking is existing. He was entirely, naturally, completely understanding that thinking is existing. He was almost completely using this thing, understanding that thinking is existing. He was naturally almost completely using this thing, that thinking is existing. He was not completely using that thinking is existing. He was completely understanding that thinking is existing. He was completely clearly thinking. He was thinking of something. He was thinking of anything. He was thinking of everything. He was completely, naturally, he was naturally and completely understanding that thinking is existing. He was not entirely, completely using this thing, using that thinking is existing. He was not repeating that thinking is existing. He was not repeating that he was completely, clearly understanding that thinking is existing. He was needing to be sometimes deciding that he would not be eating everything, and this was a natural thing. He was needing to be one being living. He was needing to be understanding that thing, that he was one being living. He was being convincing in being one needing to be deciding not to be eating everything, as he was one needing to be being living and understanding that thing. He was almost completely convincing Julia Hersland. George Dehning was one being living then with him, and knowing everyone who was knowing David Hersland then, and whom David Hersland was knowing then. David Hersland was then completely understanding something, and completely then understanding anyone else's understanding of that thing. Anyone was certain of this thing, that David Hersland was understanding something, and understanding anyone else's understanding, and not understanding that thing. He was needing that anyone understanding anything should be understanding that some are understanding the thing he, David Hersland, was understanding. He was not completely needing this thing. He was telling something about such a thing, and telling it very clearly to Mr. Dehning, and Mr. Dehning was listening. And David Hersland was not completely needing that Mr. Dehning should be listening, and he was not completely needing that Mr. Dehning should be understanding this thing. David Hersland was understanding something, and was understanding anyone else's understanding of that thing. David Hersland was quite completely needing that anyone understanding anything should be understanding anyone else's understanding something. He was not completely needing this thing. Julia Hersland was completely needing this thing. David Hersland was completely convincing her of anyone being one needing this thing. David Hersland was understanding something, and was understanding anyone else's understanding that thing. He was understanding something of anyone else's not understanding that thing. He was almost needing to be completely understanding anyone else's not understanding that thing, the thing he was understanding. He was completely understanding something, and understanding anyone else understanding that thing. He was completely convincing in this thing, in understanding something, in understanding anyone else understanding that thing. He was sometimes urging this thing, urging being one completely understanding something, understanding anyone understanding this thing. He was sometimes urging this thing. He was convincing to anyone in being one understanding something. He was convincing to almost anyone in being one understanding anyone's understanding that thing. He was understanding something. He was understanding anyone's understanding that thing. He was completely clearly thinking. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was feeling and he was thinking. He was completely clearly thinking. He was almost completely clearly feeling. Completely clearly thinking and giving advice strongly enough, and not completely clearly feeling and being convincing is a different thing in different ones being living. It was in David Hersland, being one almost wanting to be one needing to be succeeding in living. It was in David Hersland, being one needing to be having something each day to be something meaning that being living is existing. It was in him, being one not completely going on being living. It was in him, being one who was definitely working. It was in him, being one not quite succeeding in being one succeeding in living. It was in him, being one telling something, and having then that many who were not then entirely completely listening. It was in him, being one deciding something and doing something, and having then some who were with him not completely be going to be doing that thing. It was in him, being one clearly telling something and not telling that thing again and again. He was, to some, one clearly telling something and not telling it again and again. He was, to some, one not completely clearly telling something and one going to be telling it again and again. He was, to some, one clearly telling something and one in some way going to be completely clearly telling it again and again. He was completely clearly telling something, and then he was needing to be completely certain that living is being existing. He was needing to be one being living to himself inside him. He was one needing being one eating, completely eating some one thing. He was then completely clearly telling something. He was then needing being one completely not eating some one thing. He was then completely clearly telling something, and he was then not telling it again and again. He was needing then to be certain that being living is existing, that there is being existing, that there is existing being living. He was completely clearly telling something and not telling it again. He was then almost completely wanting to be needing succeeding in living. He was wanting to be one who was one needing to be succeeding in living. He was one who was clearly convincing. He was clearly telling something. He was not telling it again and again. He was convincing, and he was with some, and they were not then completely beginning anything. He was then clearly telling something. He was then needing being certain that he was completely eating one thing. He could do something. He could completely understand doing that thing. He was understanding anyone doing that thing. He was understanding what anyone was understanding in doing that thing. He was doing something, and he was understanding that someone else was doing that thing. He could understand the way that one understood doing that thing. He was doing something. He was understanding someone else's doing that thing. He was not completely convincing as understanding anyone's doing of that thing. He was almost completely convincing as understanding some other one's doing of that thing. He was one working and clearly expressing that thing, clearly expressing that he was working. He was one understanding that someone else was working and was almost clearly expressing that thing, expressing that working. He was understanding that someone was working and was not clearly expressing that thing working. He was clearly expressing anyone's work at the thing at which he himself was working. He was doing something. He was clearly working at that thing. He was not excited in understanding anyone's working. He was not excited. He was feeling the thing, feeling someone else's working, and clearly expressing that thing that someone else was working. He was doing something. He was clearly working. He was clearly expressing this thing that he was clearly working. He could completely understand anyone's work who was working at this thing. And he could completely express this thing, express his understanding. He was not excited in understanding. He was not eager in understanding. He was not gay in understanding. He was not solemn in understanding. He was not persistent in understanding. He was not violent in understanding. He was not expository in understanding. He was continuous in understanding and clearer in understanding, and he was almost firm in understanding, and he was not repeating his understanding, and he was strongly advising some to go on with his understanding. He might have been brilliant in understanding, and he went on being understanding. He was using understanding, and he was not completing the using of understanding. He was steadily understanding, and he was clearly understanding, and he was clearly expressing understanding, and he was strongly enough advising some to be going on using his understanding. He was not fighting with his understanding because not anyone was meeting him to be fighting. He might have been fighting with his understanding. He might have been being one using his understanding in being one being fighting. He might have been fighting for his understanding. He was not ever really fighting, and this was because not anyone was really needing to be fighting him. He was clearly expressing being one understanding. He was clearly working. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was understanding other ones being working, and he was clearly expressing understanding this thing. He was not really repeating anything. He was clearly not repeating anything. He was often almost quite alone with being one being living, and working, clearly working to be completely understanding this thing. He was often almost quite alone, and he was not suffering, not at all suffering. He was clearly working. He was working and clearly working, and he was clearly thinking, and he was almost clearly feeling. He was almost completely clearly expressing that he was clearly working. He was clearly expressing that he was clearly thinking. He was often enough alone, and he had been going on being such a one who was often enough alone. He was not needing this thing, needing being often enough alone. He was naturally enough being such a one being often enough alone. He was not completely using this thing, being often enough alone. He was not completely needing being often enough alone. He was sometimes not at all using this thing, using being often enough alone. He was often not being often enough alone. He was sometimes going on with this thing, going on with not being often enough alone. He was not ever completely using being often enough alone. He was certainly very often alone. He was certainly often enough alone. He was not completely using this thing, using being often enough alone. He was often alone. He was often going on with this thing, going on, being often alone. He was being one being living. He was not completely needing being certain of this thing, certain of being one being living. He was naturally thinking clearly about this thing, about being living. He was completely clearly thinking about this thing, about being living. He was being living. He was using this thing then, when he was beginning the beginning of middle living. He was using then being one being living. He was then almost completely using that thing then. He was not completely using that thing then, not completely using then being one being living. He was not one commencing again and again being one being living. He was completely clearly thinking about something. He was interested in any one's being one being thinking about something. He was not completely interested in that thing, in any one's being one being thinking about something. He was completely clearly thinking. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was not commencing again and again being one being living. He was almost understanding every day being one being living. He was almost needing understanding every day being one being living. He was needing understanding that being living is existing. He was needing understanding that being living is existing. He was not completely needing to be certain that being living is existing. He was almost understanding every day being living that day. He was not commencing again and again, being one, being living. He was not commencing being one, being living. He was expressing something. He was completely, clearly expressing something. He was not mentioning this thing again and again, that he was completely, clearly expressing something. He was telling something. He was quite often telling something. He was not quite completely telling something. He was certainly almost completely interested in completely telling something. He was completely, clearly thinking. He was almost completely, clearly feeling. He was completely, clearly expressing something. He was completely, clearly telling something. He was interested, completely interested, almost completely interested in expressing, completely expressing something. He was telling something. He was not mentioning again and again that he was telling something. He was telling something. He was completely, clearly telling something. He was almost completely interested in anyone's telling anything. He was not completely interested in anyone's telling anything. He was expressing something. He was completely, clearly expressing something, and he was not completely telling that thing, completely telling that he was clearly expressing something. He was clearly expressing something, and he was certainly completely interested in that thing, in clearly expressing something. He was completely expressing something. He was almost completely, clearly expressing everything. He was not completely, clearly expressing everything. He was not completely expressing anything. He was almost completely expressing something. He was not beginning again and again, being one, being living. He was going on being living. He was being living, and he was understanding this thing. Understanding being living is being existing. He was going on being living. He was needing understanding this thing to be one completely understanding something, to be completely expressing something. He was needing being one understanding that going on being living is something being existing. He was not needing understanding going on being living. He was not understanding going on being living. He was understanding being living, and he was not commencing again and again being living. He was understanding being living. He was being living. He was going on being living, and he was not completely clearly thinking about going on being living. He was almost completely clearly feeling going on being living. He was not needing being one, being going on being living. He was not commencing again and again being one, being living. He was being living. He was completely clearly thinking. He was completely clearly expressing something. He was going on being living. He was not needing that thing, not needing going on being living. He was completely understanding being living. He was needing every day to be understanding being living. He was not needing to be certain that any being living is existing. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was feeling something. He was completely clearly expressing something. He was needing to be one clearly expressing complete thinking. He was going on being living. He was not commencing again and again being living. He was not commencing being living. He was not needing in his thinking being one going on being living. He was not needing in his feeling being completely certain that being living is existing. He was not commencing again and again being living. He was needing to be understanding something, to be understanding every day, being living every day. He was understanding thinking. He was completely, clearly expressing something. He was not commencing being living. He was not completely interested in completely expressing something. He was being living. He was not mentioning anything again and again. He was expressing something again and again, almost completely clearly expressing something again and again. He was clearly expressing something. He was not completely needing going on being living. David Hersland was one not really needing something. Julia Hersland was one not really needing something. George Dehning was one not really needing something. Alfred Hersland was one not really needing something. Each one of them was one not really needing something. Each one of them was a very different one in being such a one, in being one not really needing something. David Hersland was one not really needing something. He was not needing being one succeeding in living. He was not needing being one needing another one. He was not needing being certain that being living is existing. He was not needing being one going on being living. He was not needing something. He was not needing giving Julia Hersland anything. He was giving Julia Hersland something. He was giving it to her to be understanding that he was being one who was understanding every day, being one being living. He was not needing to be giving her this thing. She was not needing to be having this thing. He was giving her advice strongly enough about her being one being living. He was not needing to be one doing this thing, giving her advice strongly enough about her being one being living. She was using the advice he was giving strongly enough. She was not needing this thing, not needing to be using the advice he was giving to her strongly enough. She was not really needing this thing, not needing to be using the advice he was giving to her strongly enough. She was not really needing this thing, needing the advice he was giving to her strongly enough. She was using this thing. She was using, could be using, the advice he was giving to her strongly enough. He was not needing being one giving her advice strongly enough about being one being living. He was not needing being one bringing her to be understanding that he was understanding every day that he was being living. He was not one really needing something. He was one not really needing something. Julia Hersland was one not really needing something. They were quite different, the two of them, in being such a one not really needing something. George Dehning was one not really needing something. He was one succeeding in living. He was one completely admiring David Hersland. He was one being one completely in Dehning living. He was not one needing being such a one being completely in Dehning living, being one succeeding in living, being one entirely admiring David Hersland. David Hersland was telling him many things, and David Hersland was not needing that thing, was not needing being one telling him many things. Alfred Hersland was not one needing something. Alfred Hersland was one not succeeding in living. Alfred Hersland was one not going on loving Julia Hersland. Alfred Hersland was one coming to know very many who came to know him, and he was then almost succeeding in living. Alfred Hersland was one being proud enough in being one having David Hersland liking well enough being a brother to him. Alfred Hersland was not needing something. He was not needing being not going on loving Julia Hersland. He was not needing coming to know very many who came to know him. He was not needing not succeeding in living. He was not needing almost succeeding in living. He was not needing marrying again. He was not needing something. He was not needing having David Hersland being a brother to him. David Hersland was not needing something. He was not needing being a brother, liking well enough having Alfred Hersland as a brother. David Hersland was not being one needing something. He was one knowing completely well then, and more than, Julia Hersland and George Dehning, and some who knew them and who came to know him. Certainly he was not one needing anything. David Hersland was not one needing anything. He might have been one succeeding in living. He might not have been one succeeding in living. Certainly he was not really needing anything. He was not needing anything. He was not needing something. He was beginning succeeding in living. He was beginning not succeeding in living. He was not needing something. He might have been one needing something if he had been one being one needing going on being living. He was not one needing going on being living, and he might have been one needing going on being living if he had been one needing something, if he had been one needing being one succeeding in living. He was not one not needing succeeding in living. He was one not needing going on being living. He was one who might have been one needing going on being living if he had been one needing succeeding in living. He was not beginning being living. He was not beginning again and again being living. He was giving advice strongly enough to some. He was completely not eating some things. He was understanding being one being living. He was wanting to be needing being certain that anyone was completely a beautiful one. He was not completely wanting needing this thing. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was strongly enough giving advice to some. He was completely not eating something. He was being one being living. He was not needing being certain that there is being existing being living. He was strongly enough giving advice to some. He was certain of this thing, of being one then giving advice strongly enough to some. He was completely not eating some things. He was not one really needing something. He was one being interesting. He was one knowing that he was keeping a mind open. He was doing something of this thing. He was keeping a mind open. He was doing something of this thing, and Julia Hersland was needing, feeling, being one, having something of this thing, having a mind which was keeping open. He was knowing something of this thing, of keeping a mind open, and having then something more come in to make that one have it to be understanding something. He was knowing this thing, knowing that he was doing something in being one, keeping some mind open. He was one completely clearly thinking. He was one completely not eating something. He was almost completely interested in being one keeping some mind open. He was beginning this thing, beginning keeping some mind open. He was knowing this thing, knowing that he was beginning this thing, beginning keeping some mind open. He was almost completely interested in this thing, interested in keeping a mind open. He was not succeeding in living, in being one not being living after the ending of the beginning of middle living. He was being interesting. He was completely clearly thinking. He was completely not eating something. He was completely giving advice strongly enough. He was beginning being one, keeping a mind open. He was clearly expressing something. He was completely, clearly understanding anyone expressing that thing. Each one of the Dehning family came to know David Hersland, and each one of them were sometimes telling him something of this thing, were telling him something of knowing him. Each one of the Dehning family came to tell him something of that one knowing him. Mr. Dehning and Mrs. Dehning and Julia Hersland and George Dehning and Hortense Dehning, each one of the Dehning family, came to know David Hersland and told him something of this thing, told him something of their knowing him, of each one of them knowing him. Mr. Dehning came to know him, and he told him of this thing of knowing him. He told him that he liked it well enough knowing him, that he liked it very well knowing him, and that he, David Hersland, was a man to understand something of such a thing, of Mr. Dehning knowing him. Mr. Dehning told him something of being one knowing David Hersland, and recognizing David Hersland's, in a way, understanding that he was being one being living. Mr. Dehning was knowing David Hersland, and knowing that he, David Hersland, could understand this thing, and could not then be completely succeeding in living in being one, not beginning again and again in being living, in being one, not beginning in being living. Mr. Dehning was telling this thing to David Hersland, and telling him that if there was any of way succeeding in living in being one not beginning being living, in being one not beginning again and again in being living, David Hersland would be succeeding in being living. Mr. Dehning was knowing David Hersland and telling him again and again something of this thing, something of knowing him. Mr. Dehning was not completely certain that David Hersland would not be succeeding in living. Mr. Dehning was quite convincing in telling David Hersland that David Hersland was certainly in some way understanding that he was being living. That David Hersland was in some way understanding that being living is existing. Mrs. Dehning was knowing David Hersland and was telling him something of this thing, was telling him something of knowing him. She was knowing him and not liking this thing, and very often she was liking this thing, and she could tell anyone something of this thing, and she was telling him of this thing, of telling anyone something of knowing him. She was knowing him and telling him very often, telling him all the same thing about this thing, about knowing him. She was knowing him and knowing he was one having been living in Hersland family living. She was knowing him and knowing he was living in Dehning family living. She was telling him something of this thing, of her knowing him. She was knowing him in his being one completely not eating something, and she was telling him that she was then completely knowing him. She was knowing him being one, being interesting, and she was telling him, completely telling him almost everything of her being one, knowing him, being that thing. She was not needing him being one, being certain that being living is existing, and she was knowing him as being one. She was needing, being one, knowing that being living is existing, and she was telling him, often telling him, anything of this thing. She was liking this thing, knowing him, and certainly she was not needing this thing, not needing liking this thing, liking knowing him. And she was knowing this thing, knowing that she was not needing liking him, and she was knowing him, and she was telling him sometimes, and the same way, something of this thing, something of knowing him. He knew Julia Hersland, and she told him this thing, told him that she knew something in his being one, understanding something. He knew something, and was understanding anyone understanding that thing. She knew this thing, and was having then that thing, having existing, that he was understanding something, and understanding anyone who was understanding anything of that thing. She was certain enough that being living is existing. He was not really mentioning that thing. He was not mentioning anything of being living, being existing. She was going on being living. She was not mentioning anything of any such thing, of going on being living. He was knowing almost every one that she was knowing then. He was knowing some then, and sometimes was not mentioning to her this thing, mentioning knowing some then. He was knowing some then, and sometimes he was mentioning this thing, mentioning knowing some then. They were, each one of them, knowing Alfred Hersland then. They were each one of them mentioning that thing, mentioning knowing him then. They were going then, each one of them was going on then mentioning that thing, mentioning knowing Alfred Hersland then. Each one of them was knowing Alfred Hersland then. David Hersland was telling Julia all of that thing, all of his knowing Alfred Hersland. Julia Hersland was completely telling David Hersland all of her knowing Alfred Hersland then. They were each one of them telling this thing, telling, knowing Alfred Hersland. David Hersland was understanding this thing, understanding, knowing Alfred Hersland. Julia Hersland was understanding this thing, understanding, knowing Alfred Hersland. David Hersland was knowing Julia Hersland, and she was telling him enough about this thing. He was knowing Julia Hersland. She was going on being living. He was being living. They were not then telling too much about those things, about his being living, about her going on being living. They were telling something about these things. Each of them was telling something about these things, about her being one going on being living, about his being one being living. She was telling about her being one going on being living. She was telling something about this thing. He was telling something about this thing, about her being one going on being living. He was giving her advice strongly enough, and he was then not needing this thing, not needing being one giving her advice strongly enough. He was completely then doing that thing, giving her advice strongly enough. He was almost completely then interested in that thing, in giving advice to her strongly enough. He was then being in the living the Dehning family were living. He was knowing then each one of them. Each one of them was telling him about this thing, about his knowing each one of them. He was then knowing Julia Hersland. He went on then knowing her. He was then not being one succeeding in living, not being one not succeeding in living. He was knowing the Dehning family then. He went on knowing them then. He went on knowing Julia Hersland. He was almost completely interested in her, being one going on being living. He was not completely interested in that thing being existing, in going on being living, being existing. He was interested in that thing, in going on being living, being existing. David Hersland did go on being living until the ending of the beginning of middle living. He was then not really knowing Dehning family living. He was then knowing something of living being existing in George Dehning. George Dehning was knowing David Hersland. He had been knowing him before David Hersland was knowing Dehning family living. David Hersland had been knowing George Dehning, and George Dehning had been telling David Hersland something about this thing, about his knowing him. George Dehning was going on being living. He was not completely doing this thing, going on being living. He came later to be doing other things, and he was succeeding then quite well then, succeeding in being living. He was knowing then that David Hersland was not being living, and he did not then quite completely forget that thing, forget that David Hersland was not then being living. David Hersland was knowing George Dehning, and George Dehning was saying something sometimes about this thing, about David Hersland knowing him. George Dehning was content in having this thing as being existing, that David Hersland was knowing him. He was knowing David Hersland then, and David Hersland was knowing him then. They did not either of them quite completely mention this thing, mention knowing each other then. David Hersland did not completely mention knowing George Dehning. George Dehning did not completely mention knowing David Hersland. George Dehning was content in being one being living then, was almost content then. David Hersland was being living then, and was not mentioning that thing much then, was not mentioning being living. George Dehning was later doing some other thing. He was remembering then that David Hersland had come to be a dead one. He was quite remembering that thing then, remembering that David Hersland had come to be a dead one. David Hersland was being living, and he was knowing the Dehning family living, and each one of the Dehning family were knowing him then, and each one of them were mentioning that thing to him, mentioning knowing him. Hortense Dehning mentioned to him this thing, mentioned to him knowing him then. She was quite needing then doing this thing, mentioning something to him then, and perhaps then he would have been giving advice strongly enough to her, and she was then mentioning to him again that she was knowing him then, that he was knowing her then. Later she quite went on being living, and very often then she gave advice quite strongly enough to someone, and she did not then think anything of that thing, that he, that David Hersland, had come then to be a dead one. She was quite enough going on being living then. She was quite enough needing then, being one going on living enough then. He had come to quite completely not eating anything but one thing. He was strong then. He was strong in completely clearly thinking then. He was completely clearly thinking then. He was strong then in that thing, in completely clearly thinking. He was not then completely going on eating only one thing. He was completely strong then, almost completely strong then, in completely clearly thinking. He was then beginning being one going to be succeeding in living. He was then not living in Dehning family living. He was then not living in Hersland living, almost not in any Hersland living. He was living then in being living. He was then not going on being living. He was then being living. He was not then beginning that thing, beginning that thing again. He was never beginning being living in being living. He was never beginning again being living in being living. He was then almost not at all living in any other Hersland living than in the living he was doing in being one, then being living. He was not going on being living then. He was then going on in eating almost only one thing. And he was always then completely being one, completely clearly thinking, and he was then being living, completely being living, and he was then going on to being coming to be certain that being living is existing. He was then not going on commencing to begin to be one succeeding in living. He was then not commencing this thing, not commencing beginning to be succeeding in living. He was one who was not completely forgetting anything, and he was one who did not remember everything. He was one who did not need that thing, did not need being remembering. He did not need to remember anything. He did not need to remember everything. He did not need to be one being living. He did not need to be remembering anything. He really did not need any such thing. He was not completely forgetting anything. He did not completely forget anything. He did not forget everything. He remembered everything. He did not need that thing. He did not at all need that thing to be one being living. He did not need to remember everything to be one being living. He did not need to remember anything to be one being living. He was being living. He was not going on being living. He was not at all needing being one going on being living. He did not need to be one being a dead one. He was not at all needing such a thing, needing being a dead one. He could be remembering that he could come to be a dead one. He was almost not needing that thing, needing remembering that he could come to be a dead one. He was almost eating only one thing. He could be needing being such a one, being one eating almost only one thing. He was not really needing anything. He was not needing being certain that being living is existing. He was not needing being one going on being living. He was needing understanding that he was being living. He was almost completely needing being one completely clearly thinking. He was almost completely wanting to be feeling needing that any woman he was seeing was completely beautifully something. He was almost wanting to be giving advice strongly enough to some. He was almost being one coming to be beginning succeeding in living. He was completely clearly expressing something. He was completely understanding anyone's understanding anything of that thing. He was not really needing anything. He was not needing being one going on being living. He was almost completely needing being one completely clearly thinking. He was not needing being one remembering that anyone can come to be a dead one. He was not needing being certain that being living is something that is existing. He was not needing to be remembering anything. He was not needing to be forgetting something. He was understanding that he was being living. He was almost needing to be one almost only eating one thing. He was being living. He was understanding that thing. He was clearly expressing something. He was not forgetting anything. He was not forgetting everything. He was not needing to be one remembering anything. He was not needing to be one remembering everything. He was completely clearly expressing something. He could mention this thing, mention that he was completely clearly expressing something. He did sometimes mention that he was completely clearly expressing something. He was completely clearly expressing that thing, the thing he was clearly expressing. He could have been one being one clearly, completely clearly expressing that thing. He was such a one. He was one being one completely clearly expressing that thing, the thing he was expressing. He was not completely filling anything in completely clearly expressing the thing he was completely clearly expressing. He could have been one completely filling something in being one completely clearly expressing what he was completely clearly expressing. He was completely clearly expressing something. He was completely clearly thinking. He was almost completely clearly feeling. He was almost completely being one eating only one thing. He was being living, and he was not beginning that thing, beginning being living. He was not ever beginning again and again. He was completely clearly expressing one thing. He was understanding anyone's understanding of that thing. He was understanding anything of anyone's understanding of that thing. He was sometimes mentioning something of someone's understanding of that thing. He could go on mentioning someone's understanding of that thing. He was completely clearly expressing something. He was not being one going on being living. He was one being living. He was understanding that thing. He did sometimes mention that thing, mention understanding being living. He did not mention anything again and again. He did not really mention anything again and again. He did completely clearly express something. He was being one who was completely clearly thinking. He did do that thing. He did completely clearly think about something. He did completely clearly think about anything. He did almost completely clearly think about everything. He did think completely clearly. He did completely clearly express something. He was being living. He did understand being one being living. He did understand anyone else's understanding the thing he was completely clearly expressing. He was not feeling being one being completely a different one from any other one. He was knowing something of this thing. He was knowing something of being one who was completely a different one from any other one. He was feeling something, and there was something in him to be feeling of being one who was completely a different one from any other one. He was feeling something. There was in him something to be feeling. There was in him knowing something of being one who was completely a different one from any other one. He was not feeling that thing, feeling his being one being completely different from any other one. He came to be a dead one at the ending of the beginning of middle living. He was not feeling anything in being one being completely different from any other one. He was being this one who was completely different from any other one. He was not feeling anything in being such a one. He was not living after the ending of the beginning of being living. He was not completely forgetting knowing something of such a thing, of being one, being completely different from any other one. He was being living. He was one understanding being one being living. He was not living after the ending of the beginning of middle living. He came to be a dead one. He was completely forgetting something of being one, knowing that he was a different one from any other one. He was not feeling being one, being a completely different one from any other one. He was knowing that he was being a completely different one from any other one. He was not forgetting knowing that he was a different one from any other one. He was not feeling being a different one from any other one. He was not living after the ending of the beginning of middle living. He had come to be a dead one. He had been almost completely eating only one thing. He had been understanding being living. He had not been feeling being a different one from any other one. He had been understanding being one being living. He had been giving advice strongly enough to some. He had not been needing being one going on being living. He had not been needing being certain that being living is something existing. He had been coming, and had then not come to be beginning succeeding in living. He had been knowing being a different one from any other one. He had been understanding something, and understanding anyone understanding that thing. He had been completely clearly expressing something. He had been almost completely clearly feeling. He had been completely clearly thinking. He had come to be a dead one, and he was then at the ending of beginning living. He had come to be a dead one, and some then were knowing that thing, knowing then that he was not any longer being living. Some were then knowing that he was a dead one. He was not one who had been one being fighting. He had been one who had been completely eating only one thing. He was not one who had been one being fighting. He had been one coming to be beginning succeeding in living. He had not been one being fighting. He had been one choosing something, and not then being one coming to be receiving any other thing to go with the thing he had been choosing. He had not been one being fighting. He had been one not doing another thing then, the thing he had been choosing. He had been one coming to be beginning to be succeeding in living. He had been one who could be one completely urging that he was not one needing doing some other thing. He was completely clearly thinking. He was not coming to be one going on beginning to be succeeding in living. And he was then not fighting. And he was then almost urging being one, not needing choosing some other thing. And he was then completely clearly expressing something. And he was then going on being one, almost completely eating only one thing. And he was then one understanding anyone's understanding something he was completely understanding. He was not going on being living in being living. He was a dead one at the ending of the beginning of middle living. He was being living. He was understanding being living. He was not beginning being living. He was not beginning again and again in being living. He was almost needing being one coming to be beginning to be succeeding in living. He was knowing he was understanding being one being living. He was almost completely knowing this thing. He was not completely knowing that he was not completely needing being certain that being living is something existing. He was almost completely clearly expressing being one, not needing being one receiving doing some other thing. He was almost completely clearly expressing this thing. He was not completely clearly expressing being one almost needing to be coming to be beginning succeeding in living. He was not being one succeeding in living. He was not one failing in living. He was one not being living when he was at the end of the beginning of middle living. He was then a dead one. He was then not needing that thing, not needing being then a dead one, not at all needing that thing. He was then being eating only one thing. He came then to be a dead one. He had not been completely needing that thing, needing being a dead one. He had not been one needing that thing, really at all needing that thing, needing being a dead one. He was then understanding something, and understanding anyone else who was understanding something of that thing. He was then eating only one thing. He was then not needing to be a dead one. He was then not living then when he was at the end of the beginning of middle living. He was then one who came to be a dead one, and some were not knowing that thing before he was completely buried there, where he had come to be a dead one. He had come to be a dead one. He certainly then had been eating only one thing. He certainly then had not been needing, not really needing, not at all needing, being a dead one. He was a dead one, and he had been then one being living and understanding that thing, understanding being living, and being one being then being living. He came to be a dead one, and not any one had been needing that thing, had been at all needing that thing, had been wanting to be needing that he was a dead one. Not any one had been wanting to be needing that thing, that he had come to be a dead one. Some did not know he had come to be a dead one before he had come to be buried there, to be a buried one there where he had been a dead one. He had come to be a dead one. He had not come to at all beginning this thing, beginning being a dead one. He had come to be a dead one. He had come to be a buried one, and some then were coming to know this thing, that he had come to be a dead and buried one. Some knew he was a dead one after he had been buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Some knew it then and were earnest then in being certain that he could not have come to be a dead one, and some of such of them were saying it again and again. Some knew it then, knew that he was a dead one, after he had been buried there where he had come to be a dead one, and they regretted that he had come to be a dead one. They regretted that thing. Some of such of them were interested in anyone's regretting that thing. Some of such of them could come to be wondering if he might have been one coming to be beginning, succeeding, and living. Some who regretted that he had come to be a dead one were wondering if anyone would come to know anything about his being a dead one. Some of such of them were interested in that thing, in someone coming to know something about him as being a dead one. Some did not know anything of his having come to be a dead one for some time after he had come to be a dead one. Some of such of them were feeling it to be a strange thing that he had come to be a dead one. Some of such of them were hearing something about his being a dead one a long time after he had come to be a dead one. He was not living after the ending of the beginning of middle living. He came to be a dead one, and was buried there where he had come to be a dead one. This was a surprising thing to some, that he had come to be buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Not anyone was needing this thing, that he should have come to be a dead one, and to be buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Not anyone needed to be one expecting that he should come to be a dead one, and be buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Not anyone needed this thing. He had not needed this thing. It was not a needed thing. He had come to be a dead one, and had come to be buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Some were indignant about this thing, that he had come to be a dead one. Some were wondering about this thing, that he had come to be a dead one. Some were remembering this thing, that he had come to be a dead one. Some were regretting this thing, that he had come to be a dead one. Some were hoping that there was not this thing, his having come to be a dead one. Some were vague about this thing, about his having come to be a dead one, and having been buried there where he had come to be a dead one. Some were interested in this thing, in his having come to be a dead one, and some of such of them were wondering about coming to be knowing something about him as being then a dead one. Some were not remembering that he had come to be a dead one. Some were not certain that he would have been one coming to be beginning, succeeding, and living. Some were certain that he might then not have come to be a dead one. Some were quite certain about this thing. Some were not certain that there was any difference in anything in his being then a dead one. Some were certain that he was then a dead one, and were certain that it was an important thing. Some were certain that he was then a dead one, and were not certain that it was an important thing that he was then one not being a living one. Any one could be one not very constantly remembering his being a dead one, his having been a living one. Anyone could remember this thing, his having been a dead one, his having been a living one. End of section 58, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, August 16th, 2024. Section 59 of The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 59. History of a Family's Progress. Anyone has come to be a dead one. Anyone has not come to be such a one, to be a dead one. Many who are living have not come yet to be a dead one. Many who were living have come to be a dead one. Anyone has come not to be a dead one. Anyone has come to be a dead one. Anyone has not come to be a dead one. Very many who have been living have not yet come to be dead ones. Very many are being living. Very many who were being living are not being living, have come to be dead ones. Many who came to be old ones came then to be dead ones. Many who came to be almost old ones came then to be dead ones. Very many who were being living are not being living, have come to be a dead one. Not everyone has come to be one being an old one. Not everyone has come to be one being almost an old one. Not everyone has come to be a dead one. Some have come to be an old one and have come to be a dead one. Some have come to be almost an old one and have come to be a dead one. Some have not come to be a dead one. They are being living. Some have come to be a dead one. Some are not believing that any other one can really be only doing the thing that other one is doing. Some are not believing that someone can be coming to be doing every other thing than anything some other one would naturally be doing then. Some then come to be old ones. Some then come to be almost old ones. Anyone then comes to be one who is going to be almost any old one. Anyone is one not being a dead one. Anyone is one coming to be an old one. Anyone is one being a dead one. Anyone is one being such a one. Anyone is one coming to be almost an old one. Anyone is one only not needing to be understanding everything. Anyone is one who might have been doing the things that one is doing. Anyone is one who might do that thing, the thing that one is doing. Anyone is one whom some are knowing that anyone is not believing that that one might be doing what that one is doing. Anyone is one whom anyone might not be believing to be one who might be doing the things that one is doing. Anyone might be one, and some might be believing that that one is doing the things that one is doing. Anyone might be one, and some might be believing that that one has been doing what that one has been doing. Anyone might be one coming to be almost an old one. Anyone might be one coming to be an old one. Anyone might be one coming to be a dead one. Someone is one whom someone is certain is one going to be doing some one thing. It is certain that all someone knows of someone is that that one will be doing some one thing when something has been happening. It is certain that what someone does when something is happening is the thing someone is certain that one will be doing when something is happening. All that someone knows about someone is what is true of that one, as being one doing what that one is doing when something is happening. It is certain that someone is not believing that someone is going to be doing the thing that one is going to be doing when something is happening. It is certain that someone is not certain that someone could not be understanding something and be then doing something if that one was one being anyone being living. Someone is certain that in a way someone is one understanding that anyone could be doing something that that one has not been doing if anyone is one being anyone being living. Someone is certain that someone could not be doing something that that one has not been doing, even if everyone is one being anyone being living. Some are certain that anyone is one understanding something, could be one doing something if anyone is one being living. Some are certain that not anyone is one understanding something, is one doing something. Some are certain that anyone is one being living. Some are certain that anyone is one being living. Some are knowing only this thing about everything, that anyone is one being living. Some are knowing that not anyone is one being living. Some are knowing that anyone who is one being living is one knowing something of this thing. Some are ones not understanding anything of any such thing, of anyone knowing something of this thing, that anyone is being one being living. Some are knowing that anyone could be understanding something of this thing, that anyone is knowing something of anyone being one being living. Some have been old ones and then are not any longer living. Some have been almost old ones and then have not been any longer living. Some are ones knowing what some are not coming to be understanding. Some are ones knowing what some are coming to be understanding. Some are saying something about anyone understanding something. Some are saying something about anyone not understanding something. Some are saying something about some not understanding anything. Some are saying something about some understanding everything. Some are not saying anything about anyone being almost an old one. Some are saying something about anyone being almost an old one. Some are saying something about anyone being an old one. Some are not saying anything about anyone being an old one. Some are certain about understanding something being a thing that is coming to be interesting in being something anyone, being one being living, will be coming to be thinking about doing. Some are certain about understanding something, are certain that it is not coming to be interesting. Some are certainly knowing what someone who is doing something is doing when that one comes to be doing a thing when something has been happening. Some are not coming to be believing much of any such thing, of anyone knowing any such thing. Some are coming to be believing such a thing of someone, that one is one knowing such a thing. Some are coming to be ones being dead ones. Anyone is such a one. Anyone can come to be a dead one. Anyone is such a one. Anyone can come to be almost an old one if they have not come to be dead by then. Anyone can come to be an old one if they have not already come to be a dead one. Anyone can come to be such a one being a dead one being almost an old one being an old one not being almost an old one not being an old one. Some are knowing something about what some are going to be doing. Some are not believing that anyone is knowing any such thing. Some are knowing something of some knowing such a thing, knowing that some are knowing something of what some are coming to be doing. Some are believing that some will be ones not believing any such thing. Some are ones not believing that some will be believing any such thing. Anyone is one being living. Some are knowing all of this thing. Some are not knowing all of this thing. Some are almost old ones. Some are old ones. Some are not old ones. Some are ones coming to be almost old ones. Some are ones coming to be old ones. It is certain that it can be interesting to some that anyone can come to be almost an old one if that one has not come to be a dead one before that one has come to be almost an old one. It is certain that it can be interesting to some that anyone can come to be an old one if that one has not come before that one has come to be an old one, to be a dead one. It is certain that it can be interesting to some that there are kinds in men. It is certain that it can be interesting to some that each kind in men and women is different from the other kinds of them. It is certain that some can be certain of some kinds in men and women being different from other kinds in men and women. It is certain that someone can realize something of this thing of kinds there are in men and women. It is certain that some will come to be certain that this is completely interesting, that someone has been realizing kinds in men and women. It is certain that some will come to be realizing differences in kinds in men and women, and will come to make lists of them, and long lists of them, and others will then copy some of them of the lists of kinds in men and women, and some will then make more lists of them, many more lists of kinds in men and women. And someone then will tell something then about this thing, about men and women. And some others will then tell that thing again, and some will then tell that thing again and again, and anyone will then be one having heard something of some such thing. And some then will tell some more about men and women, and some will tell anything of such a thing again and again, and some will then go on in this thing, in telling something of the kinds that are being existing in men and women. There are kinds in men and women. There are kinds of them. There can be lists of the kinds of them. There will be many lists of the kinds of them. There are kinds of men and women. Many of each kind of them have been living. Many of each kind of them are living. Very many of each kind of them have come to be dead ones. Many of each kind of them are living. There will be lists of kinds of men and women. There will be many lists of them. There is coming to be a list of kinds in men and women. There will be a list of them. There has been some description of a piece of a list of them. There will be a list of them. Each one of them, each kind of them is one that can have a description. Each one of each kind of them can have a description. There can be very many descriptions being existing of each kind of them. Each kind of them, each kind of men and women can have a description. There are many kinds of them. Each kind of them can have a description. Some of each kind of them are being living. Some of each kind of them were being ones who were being living. Many of each kind of them have come to be dead ones. Some of each kind of them have come to be almost old ones. Some of each kind of them have come to be old ones. There can be a description of each kind there is in men and women, and there can be a description of there being young ones, very young ones, and older ones still young ones, and older ones, and almost completely older ones, and older ones, and almost old ones, and old ones. There can be descriptions of the kinds there are of men and women. There can be descriptions of each one of each kind there is in men and women. Anyone can be one coming to be almost an old one. Some can be then knowing that thing, knowing that that one has come to be almost an old one. Anyone can be one coming to be almost an old one. Some are then being the one they are being in living. They are then, when they have come to be almost an old one, they are then the one they are being in living, and it is then not a completely easy thing to be certain that they are the one that is of the kind of them that they are in being living. This is not then a completely easy thing, because then they are ones being ones then, not doing everything, and not doing everything very often, and certainly then it is not a completely easy thing to be certain that that one is being of a kind of a one, completely of a kind of a one, that that one is completely that one of that kind of a one of kinds in men and women. Certainly anyone could be one coming to be almost an old one. Certainly some have been doing this thing. Certainly some will be doing this thing. Certainly some have just been doing this thing, coming to be almost an old one. Certainly some are doing this thing, are coming to be almost an old one. Certainly some have come to be dead by then, have come to be dead, and have not come to be almost an old one. Certainly some are forgetting that some have come to be dead, and have then not come to be almost an old one. Certainly some have come to be almost an old one, and are not telling enough of this thing, are certainly not telling enough about this thing. Certainly some have begun again coming to be almost an old one. Anyone might be one coming to be almost an old one. In a way, it is not a completely satisfying thing, having come to be almost an old one. In a way, it is a thing that is a finished thing, having come to be almost an old one. Someone is coming to do that thing again and again, coming to be almost an old one. Someone is almost completely doing this thing, coming to be almost an old one. Someone could be one coming to be almost an old one, and certainly then there is such a thing. There is being almost an old one. Certainly there is such a thing. There is being almost an old one. Some can know that there is such a thing, that there is being almost an old one. Some can know that there is just enough of this thing, of there being that any one is almost an old one. Someone will be one going on enough to be such a one, to be one being almost an old one. Someone is going on enough in being that one, in being one, being almost an old one. There can be enough of that thing, of being almost an old one. There is then coming to be almost an old one. There is then this thing. there is then coming to be almost an old one. Anyone can be one coming to be almost an old one if they are not dead by then. There were families of them, families of men and women and children. They went on being ones being living. Some of them went on being ones being living. All of them were ones being living. Some of them are ones being living. These were families of them. And there are some of them who are ones being living and are marrying some other one, and there are families then of men and women and some children. There were families, and some of them are ones who are almost all of them being ones being living, and some of them have died since then and are not being living, and some of them are being living, and these are marrying someone and are being living. There are some who have had some children, and some of these children are being living, and some of these children are going on being ones being living until they are ones marrying some other one, and some of them then are ones having some children, and some of them are ones who are dead by then. There are some families, and some of them are dead then. Very many of them are dead then, when some of them are marrying some other one and are having some children, and are not having children and are not marrying. There are some families, and the children are living, and the mother is living, and the father is dead, and the children have married someone, and they have had some children, and the children are telling about anyone being one marrying someone and having some children, and are telling about not marrying, and are telling about not having any children, and are going on doing then something. There are some families, and anyone in them who has come to be almost an old one is then almost that thing, is then almost an old one. There are some families, and any one in them who has come to be an old one is almost that thing, is almost an old one. There are some families, and any one in them who is not almost an old one is almost that thing, is almost not an old one. There are some families, and anyone in them who is a young one is almost that thing, is almost a young one. There are some families, and this has been some description of some of them. There are some families, and there has been a crowd then, when all of them have been ones knowing that thing, knowing that there are some families of them. There are some families, and some of them are ones going on being something of such a thing, being a family of them. There are some families, and there are families, and anyone who has married another one is one who is being one, who has been in a family of someone. There are families, and some of them have some children, and some of them are dead then, and some of them are not dead then, and the father is dead then, and the mother is almost dead then, and the mother is living quite a long time longer then. There are families, and the mother is dead, and the father could be living then, and anyone in the family could be dead then, and anyone in the family could be living then. There are some families, and some of them are being living, and some of them have been dead then, and some of them are remembering this thing, are remembering that some are dead then, and that time has been passing very quickly all the time anyone has been a dead one. There are some families, and anyone can be married in them, and some in them are not married, and some in them are married, and any one of them, almost any one of them, can have some children, and some of them have some children, and some of them do not have children, and some of them do something, do anything again. There are some families, and some of them do again and again, do such a thing, do being such a one, do being such a family of them. There are some families, and some in such of them, are ones having been doing such a thing, being such a family of them, again, and then not again. There are some families, and any one of them can almost remember having been doing, being such a family again. There are families, and some in such of them are completely doing, having been a daughter and a son in such a family of them. There are families, and some of them are being such a one, and some in them can be being such ones. And some in them do it again and again, being such ones. Anyone might be one to do something, that is, what any family living is needing. No, not everyone is doing something that any family living is needing. Very many are doing something that any family living is needing. Any family living is needing that some are doing something and doing it very often. Any family living is needing that someone is remembering that any family living is needing that some do something very often. There is family living. Some are remembering that there is family living. Anyone can be one remembering something of this thing, that there is family living. Anyone can be one knowing that someone in that family living is remembering that family living, is needing that some are doing something often. Some are remembering that someone is completely remembering that family living is needing that some are doing something often. Anyone can be remembering that someone is completely remembering that family living is needing that some are doing something often. Anyone who has come to be almost an old one is one who has been one, not being such a one, being almost an old one. Anyone who has been one, being an old one, is one who has been one, not being an old one. Anyone who has been one remembering that someone has been completely remembering that family living needs then that some do something often, is one sometime remembering, sometime almost remembering, that someone is completely remembering that family living can be needing that some are doing something often. Some are completely remembering something of the thing that some are completely remembering that family living has been needing, that some are doing something often. Some are completely remembering and completely mentioning something of the thing that family living is going on needing some doing something often. Anyone in family living can do something often. Some in family living do something very often. Someone in a family living does something often and does it again and again. Some in family living are needing to be ones doing something often and doing it again and again. Some are remembering that some in family living are doing something often and doing it again and again, and that one is certain that some of anyone in that family living can be one doing something often and doing it again and again. Anyone can mention that someone in family living is being one going on doing something often and doing it again and again. Some can mention that someone in family living is being one going on being such a one family living is needing, being one going on doing something often and doing it again. They all do so well what they are doing. Anyone does so well what anyone is doing. Anyone does so well being one being living. Anyone does so well doing what anyone is doing. They all do so well what they are doing, anyone being living. Anyone does so well what anyone is doing. Everyone does so well what anyone is doing. Everyone is being living. Everyone does so well doing that thing, doing being living. Everyone is being in family living. Anyone is being in family living. Anyone is doing that thing so well being living. Anyone is living in family living. Anyone is living in any family living. Anyone will be doing what anyone is doing, that is living in any family living. Anyone can go on not doing something. Anyone can go on not doing being one living in any family living. Anyone can go on not doing this thing, not living in any family living. Anyone can begin again doing anything. Anyone can begin again not doing something. Anyone can go on not doing something. Anyone can begin not doing something. Anyone can have heard everything. Anyone can hear everything. Anyone cannot like anything. Anyone can know anything. Anyone can go on hearing everything. Anyone can go on having been hearing everything. Anyone can hear anything. Anyone can hear everything. Everyone is hearing anything. Everyone is hearing everything, and everyone has been hearing everything. Anyone has been hearing everything. Everyone has been hearing everything. Everyone is doing very well being living. Anyone can be in any family living. Anyone can be one beginning not being in any family living. Anyone can go on not being in any family living. Anyone can go on doing very well being one being living. Anyone can be one having been hearing everything. Being one saying something is what anyone is doing in being one being living in any family living. Being one saying something is what everyone is doing in being one being living in being in family living. Being one saying something is being one, being that one is being one, being the one saying something, saying that thing. Being one saying something is what anyone can be doing in being one being in any family living. Being one saying something, having been saying that thing is what anyone is doing in being one being living. Saying something, saying anything, having been saying something, is what anyone is doing in being in any family living. Saying it then, having said it again, having said something, being one, being in family living, is what anyone is doing who is one being living and being living, having been being living, beginning not being living, beginning being living in any family living. Saying anything again, saying something, and not then saying it again, saying something again, going on saying anything again, is what some are doing who are then not beginning being in any family living. Saying anything again, saying something then, saying something again, and then not saying anything is what some are doing, is what some are doing again, and they are then not doing anything in being one, having been in any family living. Anyone is one being living, and anyone is saying something, and anyone is saying anything again, and anyone is one having been in family living, and anyone is one not beginning anything of being in any family living, and anyone is one being in family living, and being one then not beginning anything again, and being one then saying anything again, and having been saying something, and being then not saying anything, and being then again not saying something, and being then again saying anything. Anyone being in any family living is being one having been saying something. Anyone being living is one having been saying something. Anyone being in any family living is one having been saying something again. Anyone being living is one having been saying something again. Anyone being in any family living is one saying something again. Anyone being in any family living is one saying anything and saying anything again. Anyone being living is one saying something again. Anyone being living is one saying anything and saying anything again. End of section 59, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, August 16th, 2024. Section 60 of The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 60. It is time, and anyone in any family living is one knowing something of some such thing. It is time that some in any family living are ones not forgetting that they are ones having been doing something, having been saying something. Anyone in any family living is knowing something of its being time that some in any family living have not been saying something. Some in any family living are knowing that it is time that anyone in any family living is doing something, is saying something. It is time, and some in any family living are completely mentioning such a thing. It is time, and some in any family living are coming to be certain. It is time that anyone in any family living is doing something again, and doing it again, and regularly doing it again. It is time that anyone in any family living is doing something regularly again. Anyone in any family living can come to be quite certain of such a thing. Everyone in any family living can come to be quite certain that everyone could come to doing something regularly and to go on regularly doing some such thing. Anyone in any family living can come to be one not completely mentioning something. Everyone in any family living can come to be one not completely mentioning everything. Everyone in any family living can come to be one not completely hearing everyone mentioning anything. Everyone in any family living can be one completely remembering that any family living is existing. Anyone in any family living can be one beginning not remembering that any family living is existing. Anyone in any family living can be one, being one, having been remembering that any family living is existing. There is no time to begin being in any family living for some being in family living. There is being in family living for some being in family living. There is no time for beginning being in any family living for some being in any family living. There is no time of beginning doing anything again for some being living in a family living. There is no time for being in any family living for some being in any family living. There is no time for not being in any family living for some being in any family living. Some being in a family living are certain of some such thing as being in any family living. Some being in any family living are not certain of such a thing, are not certain of being in any family living, being then existing. In their being then being living. Some being in any family living are beginning some such thing, are beginning being in any family living. Some beginning being in any family living are not going on beginning being in a family living. Some beginning being in any family living are going on beginning being in any family living. Some being in a family living are going on being in a family living. Some being in a family living are not going on being in a family living. Some are not understanding anyone understanding any family living being existing. Some are not understanding anyone not understanding something. Some, in any family living, are not understanding everyone not understanding something. Anyone in any family living is doing something then, and anyone in any family living is understanding, is not understanding anyone understanding, anyone not understanding anything. Anyone in any family living is one being in any family living. Anyone in any family living is one not being in any family living. Anyone not understanding something is anyone not understanding anything of any such thing. Anyone in any family living is not understanding everything. Everyone being living is not understanding everything. Anyone being living is not understanding anything of anyone not understanding everything. Anyone being is one being living. Anyone being living in any family living is being one existing in family living. Anyone being living is existing. Everyone being living are not understanding everything. Everyone being living is going on being living. Anyone being living is not understanding anyone, not understanding everything. Anyone being living is being living and is going on doing something in being such a one, and is then understanding that everyone is not understanding everything. Anyone in any family living is certainly not one liking everything. Anyone in any family living is one not liking anything. Anyone liking that something is being something and is then liking anything being anything, and is then not liking everything being everything, is one being in a family living, and being one liking and not liking being in a family living. Some are being one being in a family living, and they are ones going on being such a one, and they might not be ones going on being such a one, and certainly they would be ones being such a one, being ones going on being in a family living, when they were ones being in the family living in which they were being. Certainly some being in any family living are ones going on being in the family living in which they are being, and there are ones not going on being in the family living in which they are being, and they have been being young ones, and they are being ones not being young ones, and they are being ones being young enough ones, and they are being ones being almost young enough ones, and they are being almost coming to be almost old ones, and they are being coming to be almost old ones, and they are being almost old ones, and they are being old enough ones, and they are being quite old enough ones, and they are being old ones. When someone has done something, that one might then do that thing again. When someone has done something, and some other one has done something, and both of them have not then been doing some other thing, both of them might do something, and one of them might do that thing and tell the other one, and the other one might then be one going on doing the same thing. When someone has done something, that one might then do that thing again. When someone has done something, and has then not done something, that one might then do that thing again, might then do something, and then not do something. When someone has done something, and some other one has then done something, and it is a similar thing, and they both then have not been doing something, they have similarly not been doing something then. They might be doing something and not doing something together. They might, and someone may think that they will, and they may, and then they may not, they may, and then they may not, and they may not at all do something and not do something together. Certainly they may be in family living. They may be in any family living. Certainly they may not be in any family living. They may be in the family living they are then having. They may not be in the family living they are then having. One of the two of them may be in the family living that one is then having. One of the two of them may not be in the family living that one is then having. Anyway, they may be ones doing something together, and one be one then telling the other. They may not then be ones doing something together. They may be ones then not telling anything, either one to the other. There may be family living, and anyone may be expecting something to be happening, and something is happening. There may be happening what someone is expecting. There may not be happening what someone is expecting. There may be something happening, and anyone then knowing anything of any such thing will be expecting, will not be expecting, something that is then going on happening. Any family living is existing, and anyone in any family living is one knowing something of family living being existing. Anyone doing anything is expecting to be one doing or not doing anything. Anyone in any family living is one doing or not doing something, and is one then expecting to be one then doing or not doing something. Someone has been standing up and is then doing something. Someone is doing something standing. Anyone will do something standing. Someone has been standing in doing something. Certainly anyone is standing in doing something. Someone was standing and doing something. He was doing that thing. He was standing and doing something. He was doing something and he was standing. He was one someone was seeing. Some were seeing him doing something and standing. Some are doing something. Anyone is doing something. Someone is doing something and standing. Some are doing something and standing. Anyone is doing something and standing. Someone was doing something and standing. Anyone doing something and standing is one doing something and standing. Someone was doing something and was standing. Anyone doing something and standing is one doing something and standing. Anyone doing something and standing is one who is standing and doing something. Someone was doing something and was standing. That one was doing something standing. Anyone doing something standing is doing something standing. Someone is doing something standing. Anyone doing something standing is one doing something standing. Anyone doing something and standing is one doing something and standing. Someone was standing and doing something. That one was one standing and doing something. That one was doing something and was standing and doing that thing. That one was one doing something. That one was one doing something standing. That one was one standing and doing something. That one was one doing something and standing. Everyone doing something and standing is one doing something and standing. Anyone doing that thing is one doing such a thing. Anyone doing such a thing is one doing something and standing. Everyone doing something and standing is one doing such a thing. Everyone doing something and standing are all of them doing that thing. Any one of them do that thing if they do that thing, any one of them. Any of them standing and doing something are standing and are doing something. Anyone standing and doing something is one standing and doing something. All of them, all standing and doing something, are standing and doing something. All of them, all who are one standing and doing something, are all of them, are all doing something and standing. Any one of them doing something and standing is one doing something standing. There are many of them. That is a natural thing, as everyone is one doing something standing. There are many of them. That is a natural thing. There are many being living. There are many family livings being existing. There are many being one being living. There are many being one being in family living. Any one of them will do, and there are many of them, any one of them will do for being one being existing, for being one being in a family living. Any one of them will do as every one of them is existing, as any one of them is in a family living. Everyone being in a family living, when they are no longer living, have come to be a dead one. Anyone, having come to be a dead one, is not then being living. Very many have come to be dead ones, and are then not any longer living. Anyone having come to be a dead one is not then any longer living. Everyone in any family living, when they have come to be dead ones, are then not any longer living. There are very many being living. There are very many living in family living. Anyone in any family living has been one who has been one being living. Anyone in any family living who has come to be not any longer living has come to be a dead one. There are very many who have been living. There are very many who have come to be dead ones, to be ones not any longer being living. Anyone in any family living coming to be a dead one is then later a dead one. Anyone in any family living is sometime a dead one. There are very many who have come to be dead ones. There are very many who have been in family living who have come to be dead ones. There are very many living in family living. Some are living in family living. Anyone is living in family living, and family living is existing, and everyone is living who has not come to be a dead one. Very many are living in family living. Very many have been living in family living. Very many are living. Very many who were living are not living. Some living in family living are doing something, and are coming again and again to be one doing that thing. Some living in family living have been doing something, and have been coming again and again to do that thing. How it is done the thing someone is doing in family living, is a thing that everyone in that family living is knowing. How it is done, and how it is done again and again, the thing that is done again and again, done by someone in some family living, is a thing that everyone in that family living is knowing. Someone in a family living does a thing, and not any other one in that family living is doing enough of that thing to make it that thing the thing one in that family living is doing. Someone in a family living is doing something, and is doing it, and everyone in the family living is knowing that that one is the one who is doing that thing. Some are doing something, and in a way they are doing that thing to everyone, and there are very many of such of them, of ones doing that thing. And each one doing that thing is one doing that thing, and everyone knows that thing, knows that that one is doing the thing that one is doing. Everyone can know that that one is doing that thing, that the one doing the thing is doing the thing because the one doing that thing is doing that thing. Anyone can know this thing, that the one doing the thing is doing the thing. Everyone in the family living of the one doing the thing are knowing that that one is doing the thing. And they know this thing. They know that that one is doing that thing because that one is doing that thing. And anyone can go on knowing that that one is doing that thing because that one is doing that thing. And all in the family living of that one are going on knowing that that one is doing that thing because that one is doing that thing. Family living is being existing. There are very many knowing this thing. There are some completely knowing this thing. Everywhere something is done. Everywhere where that thing is done, it is done by someone. Everywhere where the thing that is done by someone comes to be done, it is done, and done by someone. Certainly everywhere where something is done, it is done, and done by someone. Certainly some are doing something, and it is done, and done by each one of them. Certainly in a family living where something is done by someone, it is done, and done by that one. Certainly where it is done, and done by someone, the thing that is done and done by that one is done by that one in some family living. Everyone doing that thing, and there are many doing that thing. There are almost quite enough doing that thing. Everyone doing that thing, anyone doing that thing, is doing that thing in the way that the one doing that thing, is naturally doing that thing. It is not always being completely done by that one, the thing that is done and done by that one. It is not completely done by that one in the way it is natural for that one to do that thing. Some doing the thing that is done and done by them in a family living are completely doing that thing in the way it is natural for them to do that thing. Some doing the thing that is done and done by them are not completely doing the thing in the way it is natural for them to do that thing. Some of such of them are completely doing the thing that is done and done by them in a family living. They are not completely doing the thing in the way it is natural for them to do that thing. Some are doing the thing they are doing in a family living. It is done and done by them. There are enough of them doing some such thing. Certainly not too many, certainly very many, certainly some, and each one of them is someone by whom something is done and done. There are enough kinds of them. There are very many kinds of them doing something in a family living that is done and done and done by them. Everyone in any family living who does not come to be a dead one before coming to be almost an old one comes to be almost an old one, and anyone coming to be almost an old one has it then to be as something existing that they are ones going on being living. Anyone in any family living who does not come to be a dead one before coming to be an old one comes to be an old one, and is then being one, having it being as something being existing, that they are ones going on being living. Certainly anyone coming to be almost an old one is then having it being as something being existing, that one is then going on being living. Certainly anyone coming to be an old one is one being one, then having it as being something existing, that one is being then one going on being living. Almost anyone coming to be almost an old one, coming to be an old one, is one having it then as being something existing, being one going on being living. Almost everyone coming to be almost an old one, coming to be an old one, is one having it then as being something existing, being one going on being living. Almost everyone being one coming to be almost an old one is one having been being in some family living. Almost everyone coming to be an old one is one having been being in some family living. Almost everyone coming to being an old one is one having been being in some family living. Almost everyone coming to be almost an old one is being in some family living. Almost everyone coming to be an old one is being in some family living. Some, when they are being quite young ones, are being ones doing something that is being done again and again by someone in a family living. Some, when they are older ones, are being ones doing something that is done and done and done again by someone in a family living. Some, when they are almost old ones, are being ones doing something that is done and done in a family living. Some, when they are being old ones, are doing then something that is being something that is being done and done in a family living. Some, all their living, are doing what is being done and done in a family living. When one has come to be one not going on being a living one, mostly everyone has been one being in a family living. When anyone has come to be one not going on being living, mostly anyone is then being one being in a family living. When anyone has come to be one not going on being living, any family living can be then being existing. Anyone can come to be one coming not to be going on being living. Any family living can be then being existing. Anyone can come to be one coming not to be going on being living. In a family living, any family living can then have been something being existing. Anyone can come to be one not going to be one going on being living. Any family can be one being existing. Any family living can be one having been existing. Any family can be one having been existing. Any family living can be one being existing. Anyone can come to be one not going on being living. Any family living can have been being existing. Any family living can be existing. There are very many family livings being existing. There have been very many family livings being existing. Some in any family living are older ones than any other one. Some in any family living are younger ones than any other one. Some in any family living are not so old and not so young as any other one in the family living. Anyone in a family living is younger than some other one in the family living, has been younger than some other one in the family living. Anyone in a family living is older than some other one in the family living. Some in the family living have been older than any other one in the family living. Some in the family living have come to be doing something again and again, something that is done and done in that family living. Some of such of them are older than very many then in the family living. Some of such of them are younger than some in the family living. Some in the family living who have come to be doing what is being done again and again in the family living are older than most of them in the family living. Some who have come to be doing what is being done and done in the family living are younger than most of them in that family living. Some who have come to be doing what is being done and done in the family living are older than some and younger than some of them living in that family living. The way of doing what is done and done in a family living is a way that a family living is needing being one in a way existing. Sometimes then that family is going on in that way of existing. Sometimes that family living is going on into another way of being existing. Sometimes someone who has done what is done by someone in the family living of that one is coming to be an older one and is then going on doing what that one is doing. And then it is a very different thing, the thing that one is doing in the family living of that one. Some in family living are doing what is done and done in family living being existing. Anyone in a family living is one knowing any other one in the family living. Anyone in a family living is one any other one in the family living is knowing. Anyone in a family living is not knowing that another one in the family living is doing something and doing it again and again. Anyone in a family living is doing something and doing it again, and not any other one in the family living is knowing that thing, is knowing that that one is doing something and is doing it again and again and again. Anyone in a family living is knowing that anyone in the family living is doing something and doing it again and again and again and again. Anyone in a family living is certain that some in the family living are not doing something. Anyone in a family living is certain that anyone in the family living has been doing something. Anyone in a family living is certain that anyone in the family living has been doing something. Someone in a family living is needing that everyone in the family living is certain that that one will go on being one being in the family living. Some in a family living are needing that anyone is certain that they will go on being in the family living. Someone in a family living is one needing that everyone in the family living is not doing something. Someone in a family living is needing that anyone in the family living is certain that that one is one needing that everyone in the family living are not doing something. Someone in a family living is needing that everyone in the family living is doing something. Someone in a family living is needing that anyone in the family living is certain that that one is needing that everyone in the family living is doing something. Anyone in the family living is doing something. Anyone in the family living is not doing something. Everyone in the family living is knowing that anyone in the family living is not doing something. Everyone in the family living is knowing that anyone in the family living is doing something. Someone in a family living is needing to be certain that everyone in the family living is not going to be doing something. Someone in a family living is needing to be certain that everyone in the family living is going to be doing something. Old ones come to be dead. Anyone coming to be an old enough one comes to be a dead one. Old ones come to be dead ones. Anyone not coming to be a dead one before coming to be an old one comes to be an old one and comes then to be a dead one, as any old one comes to be a dead one. Anyone coming to be an old enough one comes then to be a dead one. Everyone coming to be an old enough one comes then to be a dead one. Certainly old ones come to be dead ones. Certainly anyone not coming to be a dead one before coming to be an old enough one comes to be an old enough one to come to be a dead one. Old ones come to be dead. Any old one can come then to be a dead one. Old ones, and how they come to be dead, they come to be old enough ones to come to be dead. Anyone coming to be an old one is coming then to be a dead one. Everyone not coming to be a dead one before coming to be an old one is coming to be an old one and is then coming to be a dead one. Old ones come to be dead. There are old ones in family living in some family livings, and these, when they come to be old enough ones, come to be dead. Anyone coming to be an old enough one comes then to be a dead one. Doing something is done by some in family living. Some family living is existing. Some are doing something in family living. Someone in a family living is doing something, and family living is existing, and family living is going on being existing, and that one is doing something in family living. That one has been doing something in family living. That one is doing something in family living. That one is going to be doing something in family living. That one has been doing something in family living, and that one is doing that thing, and anyone in the family living is being one being in the family living, and that one, the one doing something in the family living, is completely remembering that everyone being in the family living is in the family living. That one is remembering something of this thing about everyone being in the family living, is remembering something about each one being in the family living, is completely remembering something about each one being in the family living, and anyone in the family living can come to be remembering that that one, the one completely remembering something about each one being in the family living, is remembering something about each one in the family living being in the family living. The one remembering, completely remembering something about each one being in the family living, has been completely remembering everything about anyone being in the family living, is remembering, completely remembering everything about some being in the family living, is completely remembering something about everyone being in the family living, will be completely remembering everything about some being in the family living, will completely remember something about everyone being in the family living. Family living can be existing. Very many are remembering that family living can be existing. Very many can go on living remembering that family living is existing. Very many are living and are remembering that family living can go on existing. Very many can go on living remembering that family living can go on existing. Family living can go on existing. Very many are remembering this thing, are remembering that family living can go on existing. Very many are quite certain that family living can go on existing. Very many are remembering that they are quite certain that family living can go on existing. Any family living going on existing is going on, and everyone can come to be a dead one, and there are then not any more living in that family living, and that family is not then existing if there are not then any more having come to be living. Any family living is existing if there are some more being living when very many have come to be dead ones. Family living can be existing if not everyone in the family living has come to be a dead one. Family living can be existing if there have come to be some existing who have not come to be dead ones. Family living can be existing, and there can be some who are not completely remembering any such thing. Family living can be existing, and there can be some who have been completely remembering such a thing. Family living can be existing, and there can be some remembering something of such a thing. Family living can be existing, and some can come to be old ones and then dead ones, and some can have been then quite expecting some such thing. Family living can be existing, and some can come to be old ones and not yet dead ones, and some can be remembering something of some such thing. Family living can be existing, and someone can come to be an old one, and some can come to be a pretty old one, and some can come to be completely expecting such a thing, and completely remembering expecting such a thing. Family living can be existing, and everyone can come to be a dead one, and not anyone then is remembering any such thing. Family living can be existing, and everyone can come to be a dead one, and some are remembering some such thing. Family living can be existing, and anyone can come to be a dead one, and everyone is then a dead one, and there are then not any more being living. Any old one can come to be a dead one. Every old one can come to be a dead one. Any family being existing is one having some being then not having come to be a dead one. Any family living can be existing when not everyone has come to be a dead one. Everyone in a family living having come to be dead ones Some are remembering something of some such thing. Some being living, not having come to be dead ones, can be ones being in a family living. Some being living and having come to be old ones can come then to be dead ones. Some being living and being in a family living and coming then to be old ones can come then to be dead ones. Anyone can be certain that some can remember such a thing. Any family living can be one being existing, and some can remember something of some such thing. End of section 60. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, August 16th, 2024. End of The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein.